You're listening to Faith in Healthcare, the CMDA Matters podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Welcome, friends, to Faith in Healthcare, where we continue to explore the issues that matter most to Christian healthcare professionals. So whether you're in healthcare, married or otherwise connected to someone who is, or you're just simply interested in how God is working right now through Christ followers in patient care and beyond, we're so glad that you're here. Before we dive in, I want to pause for something very close to my heart. Many of you know my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Doug Lindberg. On August 30th, after a courageous battle with cancer, Doug went to be home with his Savior in the presence of his loving wife, Ruth, who's also a family physician, and their teen children, Maddie and James. Doug wasn't just a gifted physician and leader. He was a man who loved Jesus Christ and poured his life into equipping healthcare professionals and students to live fully surrendered to Christ. Through his work with our CMDA Center for Advancing Healthcare Missions, he helped to shape everything from our Remedy Healing for the Nations conferences to pre-field orientation for brand new healthcare missionaries who are headed for their first assignment, and then capstone training for seasoned veterans who are considering a career or maybe a course change after a successful career in a traditional U.S.-based private practice. And if you ever spent time with him, you know that he carried a quick wit, a warm smile, and a deep love for people. I'm going to miss Doug's humor, his heart, as well as his abiding friendship. But I'm grateful that his legacy continues through his family and the missionary students and countless lives that he touched. If you'd like to honor his memory, his wife Ruth, together with Doug's family, have invited donations to continue his mission focused on the Center for Advancing Healthcare Missions right here at CMDA. You can find that link in our show notes today. Doug devoted his life to helping healthcare professionals think deeply about faith and culture and to serve faithfully in a complex world. And in that same spirit, today we're turning to one of the most significant advocacy issues of our time, and that is of the issue of abortion. In this episode, I'm joined by our Vice President of Advocacy and Bioethics, Dr. Lantz, for this important global conversation, if you will. Our guest is Dr. Amy Adamczyk. She's a sociology professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and she's the author of a fairly new book entitled Fetal Positions, Understanding Cross-National Public Opinion About Abortion. She's a first-generation college student who grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. She's also the co-author of a book that I talked about on the podcast a few years ago, Handing Down the Faith, a Christianity Today Book of the Year finalist. In her latest book, she unpacks why views on abortion, they vary so widely across nations, drawing on decades of sociological research and global data. Now, friends, while CMDA holds firmly to a biblical conviction that every human life is created in God's image and is worthy of protection from conception to natural death, we also believe that it's valuable to listen to voices outside of our own circles. And Dr. Adamczyk's research offers an eye-opening look at how culture, religion, economics, and policy shape attitudes worldwide. Now, we may not agree with all of her perspectives, but we believe her insights, they can sharpen our own thinking and strengthen our witness as Christian healthcare professionals. So let's dive in. Well, today on Faith in Healthcare, our new moniker for this weekly program at the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, I've asked our Vice President of Advocacy and Bioethics, Dr. Lantz, all the way from Eugene, Oregon, to join me today as my co-host because our topic today is going to focus on a global perspective on a pretty significant advocacy issue. Wouldn't you call it significant, Dr. Brick?
It may be one of the most significant issues in advocacy, Mike.
Okay. And because you're a medical director for a pregnancy resource center, I think this one hits near and dear to your heart. Our guest today is Professor Amy Adamczyk, and she's a sociology professor with John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And she's an author as well as a professor, and her publishing is focused on unraveling the religious, cultural, and social forces that shape public opinion on controversial issues like abortion, same-sex relations, premarital sex, marijuana, and terrorism. And there might be a few other miscellaneous that she's thrown in over the years. So, Professor Amy, thank you for joining us today on Faith in Healthcare.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you reached out to me just a few months ago and reminded me of a wonderful guest that I had several years ago. And you told me, hey, and by the way, I helped him write that book that you were asking him questions about, which is the book Handing Down the Faith. And I think your book was given some awards, even by Christianity Today. And I remember our youth pastor in my church actually preaching a whole sermon on your book, Handing Down the Faith to the Next Generation. So when you said, hey, I've got a new book, and it's Global Perspectives on Abortion, and entitled Fetal Positions, I thought I want to ask Professor Amy a few questions. So thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's just jump right into it. Your book, Fetal Positions, explores why public opinion about abortion varies so dramatically around the globe from nation to nation. And so what got you started? What made you think, I want to take a look and compare transnational views on abortion, this controversial topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was trained as a sociologist of religion, and I've long been interested in issues related to morality, deviance, those types of issues that are sort of on the edge of being illegal or might be illegal given a different time period or a different country context. And so I've long studied these issues, and I had previously written a book on views about LGBTQs across the globe. So focusing on abortion seemed a little bit like a natural step forward. But the interesting thing is that although these are both, I don't know, what you could describe as deviance or morality issues, they move in really different ways. And so in the United States, views about homosexuality or gays and lesbians or the LGBTQ community, however you call it, have changed drastically, becoming really liberal really quickly in about a 20-year time span. But until very recently, until the most recent legal changes with regards to abortion views in America really hadn't changed that much. So even though a lot of people would say, oh, these are somewhat similar issues, they do share some commonality, but they're also different in some really important ways. And the abortion issue, of course, is going to affect many, many people. It's going to affect countries. It's going to affect how people think about a whole range of different topics. And so I really wanted to get my hands dirty and try to understand this better and also see why it varies so much. So in some places like the United States, it's really, really controversial issue. But if you go to other countries, they're not having the same passionate debates that we are in this country. And that again is really interesting to me. Why is that? Or why in some places is abortion so acceptable? And then other places it really isn't. It's seen as really highly problematic. So that's what the book tries to do, is try to address this issue of why is it so different in different places.
So Amy, I really enjoy the title, The Fetal Positions, again, working with pregnant women and having ultrasonographers do the ultrasound. So obviously you had some intention with the title, but absolutely love the title. But I think our listeners will be interested in this question. And I say that because many of our CMDA members travel the world. So obviously we deal with pregnancy. It's one of the common conditions in all over the world in different countries, from third world to first world countries. And so we see the issues surrounding abortion and pregnancy throughout the world. And you've collected an enormous amount of data regarding this topic, and you've collected it from different sources. I mean, you did interviews, you had surveys, you did even just newspaper analysis, which I found interesting. So what inspired you to collect from certain sources, and how did it all come together to make this book?
Like many sociological topics, if you're going to examine something this complicated around the world, it's can be really useful to have different sources of data so that you can, to some extent, triangulate your findings and say, hey, I found that in the survey data. I also found that in the interview data, and I found that in the newspaper data. And so when I was doing this work, I did want to, include different sources to the best of my ability. And so one foundational source is the Real Values Survey. This is an amazing database that everybody can get. You guys can get it. Any of your listeners can get it. And what it is it's a survey that's been ongoing since the 1980s, and they collect data in many different countries around the world, and they ask the same questions across those nations, making cross-national comparisons possible. And they're able to get into really interesting countries like Nigeria and China and Peru and Brazil and all sorts of places. And with those data, we can then see how people view all of these different issues, including abortion. And so that became the foundational piece in this book. And I did a lot of statistical analysis. I use something called mixed modeling or hierarchical modeling, which allows me to sort of see what is really shaping individual attitudes, like which individual characteristics are shaping attitudes, but also how does the country context shape how people view this issue. So you might not be religious, but if you live in a more religious country, how does that religious belief in that nation shape how you think about this issue? So that was the survey data that I used. And then I ended up collecting close to 40 interviews in China and the United States. So I did a deep dive into the United States and China and wanted to talk to experts, including medical doctors, but also journalists and academics and religious leaders, anybody who I thought could sort of talk on behalf of the public and would have thought about this issue to some extent. And so I focused on those experts, and then they provided a lot of the substance for the statistical findings. So we could really see what's the story behind this, or what does this mean, or how are people looking at this? There's a whole bunch of other data sources in there as well, including a big content analysis of newspaper articles to see how things change in the public press and what the country characteristics are that might be shaping that. There's also data in there. I was able to draw on the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which talks more about behavior. So how does various characteristics, including religious beliefs, shape the odds that a young woman will decide to abort her first pregnancy? So that research is in there as well. So it's rich with all of these interesting data sources. So we can really unpack the different pieces that are involved in the larger question of what is it that shapes views about abortion across nations.
Well, Professor Amy, I wanted to ask you this. Before you signed on, Brick and I were talking about hard science versus soft science, and I think both of us chose a very, very hard science of surgical specialty within medicine. And as I was coming through my pre-med and had a few sociological science kind of classes, and then behavioral mental health exposure in medical school, I was like, I want to steer clear of these soft areas because it seems that they're so malleable as opposed to orthopedic surgery. It seems less malleable. But how as you went into this research, how were you able to be determined to be as objective as possible, especially considering that you were doing interviews and doing newspaper articles? And, Jonathan Haidt, the author, wrote about the righteous mind. I'm sure you're familiar with his work and how our intuition is so influential, even though we say we're all about reason, our intuition. So my question is, how were you able throughout this project, which went through COVID and a pandemic, this obviously was a challenge for you, but how were you determined to remain objective in this assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I probably take some of who I am with me to any interview that I do. So I know when I'm talking to a Chinese expert, like I'm not Chinese and I'm coming from the United States and I'm coming from, a certain background. And so I do have to acknowledge that some of that is just on the table and there's just no other choice, that this is kind of where I'm meeting people, is where I'm at. That being said, as I started to do the interviews, one of the things that you're looking for as a social scientist is patterns in what people are saying. And when you start to find those patterns and you find them amongst other individuals or other people are telling you the same things over and over again, even though they're from very different backgrounds or they're from different countries or they're from, some other difference, that tells you that you might be catching on to something. And at the same time, I'm very much an empirically based social scientist. And so I'm always looking at what's the literature that's already been done on this? Have other people found this? Is this something new? Or what's the closest thing to what I'm doing? Or does this map onto it? And so I had some interesting findings, for example, in China about how attitudes about abortion have changed over time. I actually ended up going to the survey team that collected those data in China and asking them, hey, do these findings make sense to you? Or what else should I be looking at here? Or how should I unpack this? Or am I missing something in the translation of this? Because it's not quite what I seem. I think I know what's going on, but help me understand it better. So there was a lot of unpacking, triangulating, grabbing onto different methods. So the survey data to some extent should align with the interview data. So we have 200,000 people that were surveyed. Some of what I'm finding there should shake out a little bit in the interviews. If it's not, then you start to question, okay, is there some, you start to try to unpack what else might be happening here. So it's a lot of comparisons with the data and thinking about the previous literature and embedding yourself in what is it that we know, but then also, what might make sense of this. And then just knowing there is a chance that somebody who doesn't look like me is going to get a different response. Or if one of you guys are doing the interviews, you might elicit a different response. And so just being aware of sort of how your position is interacting in those spaces as best as you can, because everybody comes to this stuff with at least some sort of baggage or some sort of image.
Well, I'm sure it wasn't a surprise to you going into this that faith, religion is going to play a major role. And that's the first chapter you tackle. So why don't you talk to our listeners about what you learned and if anything surprised you? I mean, this is the Faith in Healthcare podcast, so our listeners are very interested in how you found globally religion impacted views on abortion.
Yeah, so that is the most interesting stuff, both to me and to your listeners, is the role of religion. I'm always fascinated how religion works as a personal characteristics, like what your religious beliefs are or how strong your religious beliefs are, but also how religion works in ways that you don't even know that it's happening until some social scientist like me comes along and says, hey, I think this is going on. So in the survey data, there's 88 nations, and it represents the vast majority of the world because we've got some really big nations in there, like India and China and the United States. I'm able to show the effects of personal religious beliefs and also religious affiliation. So religious affiliation is simply the religion you say you belong to. And so I always make this joke about my partner who says he's Catholic. And then I say, sweetie, you say you're Catholic all the time, but the Catholic religion, you don't seem to, I rarely see him go to church or I see him do quote unquote Catholic things. Clearly, it may not be affecting him that much. So I do look at religious affiliation, and then I look at something that I think is even more important, and it's certainly more important for understanding views about abortion. And that is whatever your religion is, how important is your religion to you? So that might be like salience or the strength of religious beliefs, or it might relate to how much you attend, right? Because you're putting your money where your mouth is, you're going to whatever, religious services on a regular basis. And so I look at both of these components, both religious affiliation and unfortunately with the Real Values Survey, we're limited to the 5 major religions. So if you affiliate with one of those, that's Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I got them all. And we also know if you don't affiliate with any religion. And then we say, hey, whatever that religion is, how important is it in your life? And what we find is that people who say religion is really important to their life tend to be really opposed to abortion. And that makes sense in part because all of the religions have some prescriptions about abortion. So if they all say abortion is problematic in some way, then there aren't going to be a lot of differences between the specific religions. Where you're really going to find differences is how important is that religion to individuals. And so that's one religion finding that I think is both interesting and maybe a little surprising, because so it's not really a story about religious affiliation. It's a story about strength of religious belief. Secondly, I look to see if you're not religious, but everybody around you in the country, or not everybody, but on average, people in your country are more religious. What are your views on abortion? And I found a powerful effect of, the surrounding religious climate. So again, you can measure that by thinking about the average strength of religious belief within a country. That's almost as powerful as the strength of personal religious beliefs. And so there's really something to be said about the country climate, how people are thinking about these issues, the role of the media, the role of the government, the role of other institutions like the family. All of these things trickle down to shape how people view this really important issue. So I think that's really meaningful and really interesting. I do find a small Catholic effect. So nations that have a higher proportion of Catholics tend to, on average, have residents who are more opposed to abortion. And I would say I think that makes sense to a lot of people, because the Catholic Church is long been opposed to abortion. And at the same time, it's hierarchical. So you have the Pope at the top, and it's very easy for the Catholic Church to get messages sent down to the people, right? You have a big organizational structure that is very hierarchical, so that information gets disseminated quickly and, consistently. And at the same time, the Catholic Church, I think to their credit, in a lot of countries, has done a good job of developing a strong relationship with the local government. And so a lot of people, when they think about their national identity, they often think about their Catholic identity. That's a piece of kind of how they think about it. So this is something that is strong, I would say, especially when you think about Latin America, South America. Many of those Catholic nations have abortion is illegal in those places, and people are highly opposed. It makes less sense when you think about France or Italy, which are much more liberal on this issue, and part of that has to do with economic development. Poland recently changed its legislation, again, a heavily Catholic country. So I think the Catholic Church is working very closely in some parts of the world with the government. And for a lot of people, those things have become fused. And what the Catholic Church stands for, or what the Catholic Church feels or believes, even for people who aren't Catholic, trickles down to shape how they view this issue of abortion.
Amy, you have a significant section in your book comparing the United States, of course, we're Americans, and then comparing that to China. But let me preface my question. So I have the opportunity to do a lot of medical and mission work over in what I call the Balkans, which Eastern Europe, and I have a podcast coming out next month where I interview 3 ladies that are in the pro-life movement over there. But just here's the statistical analysis, and this is going to relate to my question about China. So in the Balkans, probably 95% of OB-GYNs perform abortions. In the United States, it's only about 5 to 10%. So there's the medical field that has an influence as well. And then also in America, you can state basically about 1 abortion for every 4 or 5 live births. That's kind of a statistic in the United States. That ratio is flipped in Eastern Europe. There's basically 4 or 5 abortions for every live birth. But it's also an area where it's very a-religious. Their identity is not based on a religious identity in that area. So my question is, did you pick China and compare it to the United States because China is so different than us? Is that why you did that? And tell me what you found of interest in the difference.
Yeah, no. Well, first off, my findings too in countries that have a Soviet Union history are absolutely fascinating. I know we can't talk about that here. We won't have enough time to talk about it there. But you're absolutely right. The abortion rates are the highest in the world in some of the former Soviet Union countries. And it's fascinating and interesting, and it interacts with attitudes and religion in some interesting ways. You're absolutely right. I focused in on China so that I would have some sort of contrast to the United States. Because China is so incredibly secular, I thought, well, if you're going to try to understand the role of religion, you need something to bounce it against. You need something to say, well, look, this is what this looks like in a more religious country. What does this look like in a secular nation? And of course, China has some other peculiarities about it that make it both interesting to study and a little bit challenging to study. But one of the main things is I needed a secular nation. I wanted a really big nation because I wanted to know, like, even if you just study the United States and China, you've got two of the three most populous nations in the world. So that's going to tell you something a little bit about how at least a substantial portion of the world thinks about this issue. So that was another reason that I selected it. And also, I wanted a country that didn't have a Christian background. Again, so much of the research, as you guys know, is often done in the global north, where nations historically have had Catholic and Protestant backgrounds. So in the sociology of religion, we actually don't know that much about how beliefs and so forth work in nations that have polytheistic religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. And so again, that was why picking China was going to be really interesting, because I could say, like, hey, what does abortion, like, how do people feel about abortion here? And does the religion have any role? And if so, what role? Or how does it shape views? Or how does it shape things within society? So you're absolutely right. It was to pick a country that could really contrast with the United States. Now, interestingly, there were sometimes some really neat similarities. And so not everything was a contrast. But then in other cases, I could sort of zero in on that just to make it clear what was going on.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. We'd love for you to join us at one of our regional events, the Midwest Fall Conference, September 26th through 28th on the shores of Lake Michigan, or the Northeast Regional Retreat, October 24th through 26th at Sandy Cove in Maryland. Both weekends feature excellent speakers, CME credit, and opportunities for rest, fellowship, and renewal. If you're looking for practical ways to bring the hope of Christ into your everyday patient care with respect and sensitivity, consider joining us for a Saline Process Witness Training event in November. It's a 10-hour training designed to equip healthcare professionals with practical tools for integrating faith into patient interactions. You'll learn how to take a spiritual history, pray with patients, and foster real-time connections with God in the clinical setting. Upcoming dates include Toronto, Canada on November 1st, Louisville, Kentucky on November 5th through 6th, and Dallas-Fort Worth on November 14th through 15th. For details and registration for any of our upcoming events, visit cmda.org/events. To learn more about the wide range of resources we offer at CMDA to support you in your calling, from the CMDA Go mobile app for community and event access to nearly 400 online courses available through our Learning Center, visit us at cmda.org. You'll also find a faith-based bookstore, the quarterly CMDA Today magazine, and the new Point of Medicine forum, all designed to help you live out your faith with excellence and compassion throughout your professional journey. Visit cmda.org for these and so many more resources. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
Amy, I was intrigued by, on this theme of the interviews and the experience that you had with Chinese people. You interviewed a Chinese professor, obviously a secular university professor, and was asking him about how maybe a woman would feel who had abortion. And he was talking about, well, clearly we've had our one-child policy, and she might feel this and this, and probably she'll feel some shame. And you say repeatedly in the book that it seems like maybe in China that it's not a big deal, that the issue is settled, one-child policy, abortion is common. And yet there's this issue of shame. So you clearly saw that there's some evidence of moral or cultural influence upon the Chinese population because of this issue of shame. Could you unpack that just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So China was fascinating. And I was interviewing people during COVID, which also was a very interesting time to do this research. I'm not sure we could do it again today, because at the time it was kind of like people were open and the governments were open and there was just more space for this. So it was really interesting what people said to me. So, I mean, when I would first ask people attitudes about abortion in China, often what they would say is abortion is no big deal. Or why are you asking that? Or don't worry, it's not a politically problematic issue like it is in the US, right? It's very controversial. Many people thought, don't worry, don't ask about social movements, but you can ask about abortion. It's not that big of it's not a big deal at all. So I would say, okay, I'd have to try to explain myself and why am I interested in this? Why is this woman from America, talking to me about this issue I think is not a big deal? So I would explain and try to unwrap it. And I mean, there were a lot of different views. I think one big challenge in China, and this accompanied every discussion, maybe not every discussion, but almost every discussion about abortion, was China's one-child-only policy. As you guys know well, that was started up in the late 1970s, really got going in the 80s. There was a little bit of activity in 1979. And what it meant is that for the majority of the Chinese population, there were several exceptions, but this is just in general, they were limited to having two people, a husband and a wife, could have one child. And if they had more than that, there were all of these penalties. And one of the harshest penalties was forced abortions. So, and there are many cases, this part is not controversial at all, where women were at times taken by local authorities to clinics and they were forced to have an abortion. But there were other restrictions that were much more successful, which is if you had another child, it would become very difficult to register that child and to get that child enrolled, because it would be like kind of illegitimate or under the radar. And then if you wanted to register that child, you have your second birth and register the child, it could be very expensive. And so one of the things you might remember reading about in the book is there was someone who said he had a friend in school called $6,000, something like that. And he said, well, that was the fee his parents had to pay for him to be able to have another child. So there were other things that the government did, like they would monitor women's menstrual cycles, and they would, keep a very clear watch on anybody who was trying to have a second child. So all of this, even if women didn't have a forced abortion, and the vast majority would not have, that would not have been very effective. The government controlled it in other ways. Many women tied their views about abortion to the one-child-only policy. And so I think for, the sense I got talking to people is that, one, it could be quite shameful to have an abortion because it sort of means that you made a mistake, that maybe you should have been more careful with your birth control, or you should have been more vigilant with your behaviors, whatever those would be. Of course, all that falls on women, right? I don't know where the guys are. But it also meant that a lot of times you didn't necessarily have a choice about the abortion. I mean, you did, but you didn't. You know what I mean? Like maybe you didn't want to have the abortion, but the penalties and the costs were going to be so high, or the idea of moving forward in life without a registered child, and now they can't attend school and they can't do these other things. There was a lot of resignation. There was some regret or some disappointment or some questions about loss, and that certainly came up in the interviews. And sometimes people would talk about religion as actually helping some of those women cope with the loss, which was something I didn't usually hear about in the United States with regards to religion and abortion. But women would say, maybe there's something we can do, or there was this sense of you should pray for the fetus and maybe they can move on then and go on into the next world, and you can feel kind of redeemed from this loss. I also found religion being used in really interesting ways that I didn't expect, and again, didn't think about in the United States, where people would say, if you're not ready to have a child in China, and especially under the one child only constraints, which just ended in 2016. So it's, when I was doing my interviews in 2020, 2021, it was still pretty recent. People would talk about, you don't let a child into this world if you're not ready for them. And people talk, linking that up a little bit with Buddhism, or with, you send that soul on to the next, another family that might be able to bring the child into the world. So very interesting things about the way religion was understood, and especially given this constraint of the one child only policy, which is, pretty rare in the world in general, but certainly affected people and continues to have ramifications for the country.
Well, Amy, as an American citizen, again, I guess I'm not surprised by some of your findings, but some of your findings I am surprised about, in that, and you correct me if I state something wrong here, but it seems like religion is still the number one factor for abortion rates, which I don't find that surprising, but you list a whole number of other factors. And I'm going to read a quote from your book. I show that neither legislation nor public abortion disapproval is significantly associated with rates. Rather, economic and educational development and gender equality are critical for decrease in abortion rates because they limit unintended pregnancies. So here's my question. One, you made a comment about men, and I would agree, not as a sociologist, but agree. If men would be more responsible, abortion rates would go down, and responsible by just caring for the woman, caring for the baby. But you mentioned the other factors: socioeconomic status, education, the type of government, gender inequality, and then you have a whole list of other value systems within countries. I guess, which of those was most surprising to you of all those factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to be clear, religion is number one for shaping abortion disapproval. So as a public opinion issue, religion matters both at a micro level and at a macro level. So definitely there. Then I said, hey, does religion shape abortion rates? I couldn't get any effect in any of my models. And as far as I know, I've never seen any studies that can find a relationship between religion and abortion rates. And part of that is because more religious nations, the most religious nations in the world, often are the poorest nations in the world. And what really seems to matter for understanding abortion rates, and you guys as doctors, I think, probably know this really well, is money. So, how does the money affect abortion rates? It affects the likelihood that a woman will end up in the precarious situation of being pregnant when she doesn't want to be. So it affects birth control, right? So it goes from, money increases birth control. That leaves fewer women in a situation where an abortion is desirable. If the birth control is excellent, you're not going to have too many abortions, right? Because you're not, women and men, couples can, or whoever can decide when they want to have a pregnancy. And so they can stop it before they even get to that point. So for explaining that, it's all about gender equality. And I think that goes back to your point about men. Men really need, this is my view, men really need to work with women. They have to think about when they want to have children. They need to take into consideration their perspectives. And if women really feel that I am not in a place where I can have a child right now, I think we'd all do the world a world of good if men would work with them to use contraception, to get the contraception, or to not have sex, or to do something so that they can not end up in a situation where her health is threatened. She's she's got too many kids she's worried about caring for. She doesn't have enough money. The guy's going to leave her. Whatever the many situations women are that for obtaining abortions. I think that would really improve things. And certainly, gender equality tends to lower the abortion rate, in part because the men and women are talking to each other, they're listening to each other, they're taking into consideration their preferences, and the money comes in because it affects access to birth control. So if you can get a lot of access to birth control, you can get a handle on, I don't think in general anybody wants an abortion, but it ends up coming up when these very difficult circumstances are there, and then that contributes. So yeah, good point.
So the next question will be a little more philosophical, if you think that way, and not just as a sociologist, but as followers of Christ, as Christians, we certainly understand that what we believe does not always transport to our behavior. In other words, sometimes our behavior does not follow what we believe. And that's not only true for the individual, but for cultures and people in general. So did you find differences across the globe in regards to what people actually believe and then what they actually practice?
Yeah, it's a great question, because sometimes our data is not always very good. It's actually a little bit easier to collect public opinion data on abortion than to get data on abortion behaviors. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense.
Yeah. So there's some estimates out there in each country. And then in the United States, I've used the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which has questions about abortion, and thankfully longitudinally. So, because if you ask a woman her religious beliefs on the day she's getting an abortion, we don't know what came first, right? Is she going to change her religious belief? I mean, this is, she just maybe did something that is hugely upsetting to her religion. So she may find herself less religious, right? Or is she not very religious and then she made this decision? So the causal order is really sticky with that one. I mean, if I think about the inconsistency between attitudes and behaviors, and the fact that religion, I found almost no effect at the country level, I would say there's a big disparity there between what people believe and what they're actually doing.
Let me ask the question just a slightly different way then, and it goes to morality, taking morality away from religiosity, if you will. So, and you put this in your book, I don't remember exactly what section it is, that as Christians, we believe that life begins at fertilization. I mean, that's kind of what but there's a lot of people that believe that aren't Christians. I mean, a significant number of scientists and other public officials believe that as well. So do you delve into the morality of the issue and how that affects behavior, taking away the religion? Does that come up at all?
I would say that a good case test, or a good test for that would maybe be China, where they don't officially have religion obviously in the same way we do, but even strength of religious beliefs. So you're kind of wiping out religion in the traditional ways. And then focusing in on the morality, I was impressed at how much people talked about the morality of abortion in shaping people's views and behaviors in China, in the interviews. So people would regularly, even though it's not a religious country in any sense of the imagination, but because I thought they would say like, well, it's just like pulling a tooth, or it's just, it's not it's a small medical procedure that really doesn't, deal with issues of morality. But there was a lot more of it than I thought. I don't know if that quite answers your question.
No, I find that interesting. I find that very interesting.
In different ways, like sometimes in ways that you wouldn't have envisioned, like, so I remember, more morally, maybe you should get the abortion because, you can't support this child. So, and I didn't really hear that in the United States at all. So that's a different way of thinking about morality. And then other times people saying, I think this is really painful for a lot of women. And then some people saying, I think from a moral perspective, there's a lot of there's a lot of grief about abortion, especially when they couldn't control it, or you wanted something different. You wanted to have the baby and you weren't allowed to. So there was a lot of, I think, soul searching for people around this issue. Now, that being said, I definitely talked to some very liberal faculty members who were like, this is not a moral issue. That doesn't come up, but I'd be dishonest if I said that was the majority. It wasn't. There were a lot of people that talked about the morality of the issue and they don't have religion the same way. So it's a very, you kind of do take it out when you think about it in that context. So yeah, good question.
Well, Amy, I asked you early on, about implicit bias, and you know who you know, you're connected to whom you're connected. And between Dr. Lantz and myself, we know, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of doctors who participate and work in a pregnancy resource center. And so I wanted to point out to you that the one interview that you did in your chapter on religion, abortion attitudes, that I think the employee from the pro-life clinic, I just have to say, I don't think that they represent a very tiny minority of the views. And you said an employee from a pro-life nonprofit explained religious conservatives' moral perspective on women who unintentionally become pregnant as this woman made her bed and now she has to lie in it type thing, and she should have kept her legs closed. And I'm, to the hundreds who are listening to this or watching us right now, I bet they cringed as they heard me read those words, because we get to work with just some of the most precious, compassionate, merciful people on the planet as physicians and PAs and so forth. I would say that I wish you could have a do-over on a representative interview for the views of those who come from our realm, because what motivates them is not to cast such a judgment on women, but to actually be there for them, if you will. Brick, I'm going to give you a chance because you run a pregnancy resource center in Oregon.
I could talk for hours on this, Mike, but our employees at our Pregnancy Resource Center, they love the women and they just cherish their time with them, and they don't pass judgment. In fact, our motto is, it's your choice, you have time, and we will listen. And they live by that. So they're available. They also like working at the pregnancy center because they're not tied into a clinic or hospital where it's time constrained per se. And so they just get to spend as much time loving on them as they possibly can. And they just find it so rewarding because a lot of these women are not in a situation that other women are in the United States. In other words, they may have been abused, may have been trafficked. They don't have a good social support. And so they get to just love on them, and they just cherish that time for them.
Yeah, and I will say I talked to some wonderful people that work at those clinics, and hopefully that's clearer in other chapters as well. But I didn't get the sense that these people in general were hating of women or they wanted to help them. I think they wanted to help them. And all the people I interviewed, for the most part, were very different ways of helping people, but that would, in general, there weren't. I think she wanted to capture with that quote I think she wanted to challenge that view as well. That it was, that this is sort of, we need to, think about this, or we need to, know that this perspective is there, and that maybe there are segments of the population that feel that way. But I agree with you. The people I interviewed were just lovely, even from on both sides of the issue. And I really found the issue to be much more complex than I think we generally see with this little divide we call pro-life and pro-choice. It really doesn't seem to capture the variety of different perspectives and situations, and it's an interesting space. So hopefully some of that will come through.
Well, we've been talking with Professor Amy Adamczyk on her book, a relatively new book, out, Fetal Positions, Understanding Cross-National Public Opinion About Abortion. And so delighted that you reached out to me, Amy, to share this. And your book is available obviously on Amazon, other platforms, book distributors where people can find these all over. And you also have a website. I quickly checked it out before we got together. Remind our listeners, watchers, where they can find out more about your work.
Absolutely. If you Google my name, Amy Adamczyk, you'll find it. It's amyadamczyk.com, but you just Google my name. I'm a professor, big public profile. So please reach out to me. I'd love to talk more. I'm fascinated by this issue. Tell me your views, tell me your perspectives, and let's do more research together.
Great. Brick, any final words, any questions, comments?
No, I just want to say thank you to Amy. I think this book is fascinating, and I love sociology, even though I'm very bad at understanding it at times. And I thought you brought to light a very, very important subject that we kind of focus in within our own neighborhood, our own country, but this is a global issue. And I think that's important for our members to understand that.
And I'll just say that I spent 20 years in East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. I was a little disappointed from the World Values Survey that you didn't have it color-coded in many of the Sub-Saharan African nations.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That is one of the regions of the world that I think the World Values Survey, they would love to do more work, but the infrastructure and the challenges have been more severe there. And same with gathering abortion rate data and abortion behavioral data. So we're doing, I squeeze that data for everything I could get, but a lot more work needs to be done. So hopefully the book too will move people forward and say, let's not just study Europe and the United States. Let's look at how these countries look in dialogue with each other, or how different they are in different parts of the world.
Well, we'll have all kinds of information in our show notes today here on Faith in Healthcare. Professor Amy Adamczyk, I hope we'll get to cross paths again someday. Many thanks to Dr. Amy Adamczyk for joining us today and sharing insights from her important book, Fetal Positions. Conversations like this remind us that the abortion debate is not only a medical or political issue, but a profoundly human one, shaped by faith and culture, economics, and morality all around the world. As Christian healthcare professionals, we affirm that every unborn child is made in the image of our God, and we remain steadfast in our calling to protect both mothers and their children with compassion as well as conviction. At the same time, we can grow by engaging with perspectives that differ from our own, learning how others think, and how we can better communicate the hope of Christ in these complex and controversial cultural settings. And remember, here on the podcast and throughout CMDA, you've got a community that stands with you. We're here to encourage you, to strengthen you, and support you as you navigate the moral and ethical and spiritual challenges of practicing healthcare in today's environment. So if this episode encouraged you, would you share it with a colleague, a friend, or a student? And be sure to follow the podcast on social media to stay connected. Your support helps us grow this community so that we can advocate for and equip healthcare professionals in all the specialties to take Christ to all of the earth. If you followed CMDA's The Point blog, you know that it's been a space for thoughtful, faith-driven reflections on medicine as well as meaning. Well, now we're excited to invite you to the next chapter, which we're calling The Point of Medicine. It's a new forum where the conversation around some of today's most contested healthcare topics continues and goes even deeper. It's a place to engage with others who see medicine not just as a profession, but as a calling, one that honors God, but also wrestles with real questions and seeks truth with humility and purpose. At CMDA, we'd love for you to join us. You can go to cmda.org/point to join in that vibrant discussion. Next week, I'll be joined by Dr. James Tour, one of the world's leading nanotechnologists and synthetic chemists. With over 800 scientific publications and more than 130 patents, Dr. Tour is also known for boldly sharing Christ in some of the most elite scientific circles today. He talks about how his faith, and in particular, his daily communion with God, inspires his innovative discoveries, why he sees science and Christianity as allies, and what encouragement he has for healthcare professionals seeking to live out our faith with courage despite the pressure to stay quiet. You don't want to miss it. I want to thank you for listening to Faith in Healthcare, the weekly podcast from the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, where our mission remains the same, bringing the hope and healing of Christ to the world through committed Christ followers in healthcare. That's what matters to us every single day at CMDA. May you recognize this week that the Lord is with you and that He is for you to do His good work. Thanks for listening today, and And Lord willing, we'll see you next time on Faith in Healthcare.
Thanks for listening to Faith in Healthcare, the CMDA Matters podcast. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.